For those of you who don't know, Mark Oldknow is one of the better presenters that we have in the state, if not the best, and is the, I believe, personal representative to our, is it Deputy Inspector General?
Deputy, yes. Yep. Deputy of the Supreme Council in New Mexico.
There you go. It's a big long title that I very seldom get right, but he's something of a personality around the state, and if you haven't seen him present, you're in for a treat. Even if you have seen him present, you're in for a treat. So, Brother Oldknow, are you able to share your screen and do all the things you need to do?
Let's find out. It always seems to behave a little bit differently on different ones, but let me see if I can make this happen. Oh, that didn't work. Hang on.
I've got a full picture of you.
Yeah, it's telling me that it's select. Oh, I know what I'm doing wrong.
There it goes.
Brethren, thank you, as always, to Sandia Mountain 72. Every year, you guys welcome me back to do another presentation. I appreciate any opportunity to pontificate, as you all know, and I really enjoy just the company. The things that we get to talk about are, I think, are interesting. Alex asked me to look at this particular topic several months ago. It jives with something that I've been doing for several months now in the context of the Scottish Rite, including the only one of 3 scheduled Scottish Rite workshops around the country in Charlotte, North Carolina, that we got in before the COVID hit. The reason that I'm mentioning it is that I've been talking about virtue from different angles and different presentations and its role in Freemasonry. I'm of the opinion that Freemasonry, one way to frame it, is that we are a school of virtue. Not only do we mention, at least obliquely, the 4 cardinal virtues, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment, within the entered apprentice degree, but as you get into Scottish Rite Masonry, we expand upon the idea of virtues. So each of the degrees can be exemplified or is an exemplification of a particular virtue. Some of them are actually kind of drawn out. Toleration is a big one that we talk about in the context of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. It's an important topic, not just because I think virtue, along with civics and some other things, are words that we don't use anymore in our vocabulary, not our social vocabulary, not our civic vocabulary. And we need to reintroduce these ideas. They need to play a richer role in what we do together. But I would also say that in my travels, what I'm finding is that particularly the younger men, those guys who we are targeting or we're trying to bring in and grow as Masons, are particularly interested in this. In Charlotte, it was the fellows who were attending, the younger guys who were representing their valleys that were really excited by the idea of virtue as the core of leadership that we have to develop within ourselves as persons, as Freemasons, and as a Scottish Rite organization. So I think this is one angle, this is one slice of really a very important topic. So having said that, I want to speak, just before we go into it, a little bit about philosophy in general and a little bit about what I mean by Scottish Rite philosophy. So, philosophy, in my degree, my undergraduate degree is in philosophy and mathematics, by way of full disclosure. Philosophy has gotten a really bad rap, I think, particularly here in America, over the past generation or two, along with all of the liberal arts, unfortunately. I'm going to admit, Pedro, the and it's unfortunate because it's played a role in education, but in social as well, in social development for, oh gee, the better part of 5,000 years. Talk about tossing out the baby with the bathwater. Philosophy is something that we have to come back to reevaluate. Thank you, Alex. It needs to play more of a living role in what we do, because it is a living, it's a way that we relate to the truth. So philosophy needs to be understood as not being an answer. Philosophy does not get you to an answer to any of the great questions it asks. If you could get to the answer, you wouldn't need philosophy. What philosophy does is it raises a question about the nature of truth. And it asks you to go on a journey to explore it with other minds, using dialectic, using the tools that God built into us as rational human beings, and to exercise those together. It doesn't promise that you're going to come to a period at the end of the sentence, but it does promise that if you're willing to take the journey faithfully, you're going to see and learn some incredible things, and you will, like a maypole, you will wrap gradually around the truth. And again, it's always going to look different from a different angle. Truth is not a simple thing, but philosophy offers us a way to get at its full richness. So, by way of defensive philosophy, we're going to touch on it from a couple of different angles in the course of the presentation. You know, again, one just by way of one metaphor, you know, I think it was Niels Bohr who said, when he was talking about quantum physics, there's a famous line where he says, if you think you understand it, you don't. Well, that's the nature of all great truth. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore the nature of a great truth tonight, justice. And we're going to do it particularly from a Scottish Rite angle. And here, what I mean is that Scottish Rite as a philosophy, and it, you know, again, you're hard pressed to really come out and point at and very succinctly define what Scottish Rite philosophy means. But I want to give you a couple of headlines that again dance around this idea. Scottish Rite philosophy is intrinsically connected to virtue. It speaks about it constantly. So it's orienting us to an idea of a good, of a greater good. So I think that's one kind of bullet headline that I want you to understand about Scottish Rite philosophy. It's oriented to trying to define what's a good that we perhaps share in common. The other piece that I think is relevant to hold in mind as we go through the course of the presentation is that one of the ways that Scottish Rite approaches virtue and its philosophy, if you will, is that it emphasizes it as a relationship between people, a relationship to truth. It looks at how things properly relate to each other, how they achieve a right relationship or a balance, a sense of harmony. This is extraordinarily valued as a core idea within Scottish Rite Freemasonry, this notion of balance or of harmony. So again, I think one of the things that you'll see coming out of this presentation is how justice reflects particularly those two aspects of Scottish Rite philosophy. It's a virtue, it's an odd virtue, as we'll go through, but a virtue nevertheless. And it speaks to that sense of harmony or balance that is so valued, so heavily underscored and promoted in everything that we do within the Scottish Rite. So having said that, let's start with our Hefe. And again, I would be, I think, a little bit disingenuous not to say that, all philosophers, like all men, come with great strengths and they come with great foibles. Philosophy itself is about development, about learning, about changing, about aligning yourself with truth. And that was true of General Albert Pike, the guy who really, if not so much the founder of the modern Scottish Rite, but certainly the one who kind of had the vision and collated a lot of the information that became the degree system that we use today. His book, Morals and Dogma, that this quote comes from, is a very difficult book to get through, but well worth it. It's a collection of ideas and opinions and cultural observations across a wide range of themes, in which Scottish Rite philosophy and values and virtues begin to emerge. This quote comes from chapter 2 of Morals and Dogma. And what's interesting is that's really the chapter that is dedicated to the Fellowcraft degree. If you know Scottish Rite Freemasonry, we consider the first 3 degrees as, as foundational. They're the Masonic degrees. You have to be a Master Mason in order to proceed through the remaining 4th through 32nd degree. In Louisiana, where it's a red lodge as opposed to a blue lodge, the degrees are actually the 3 degrees we call Blue Lodge degrees, are actually presented through a Scottish Rite context. It's very interesting that in the degree, the Fellowcraft, that represents the, if you will, the Mason in his prime and the, as a laborer working on the temple, working in the sun, at the height of his abilities, that this is where Pike really introduces, very early on, the whole idea of justice. It's evolved a little bit more very shortly thereafter in the 7th degree. We'll talk about that momentarily. But it's important that Pike introduces this idea of justice very early on, because everything else that the Scottish Rite says and that Pike says about tyranny, about alignment, about what is valuable and worth pursuing in order to develop yourself as a Mason and as a good man, needs to be understood in order to be able to appreciate any other thing that follows. So he introduces this whole idea of justice very early on, and then he expounds upon it further very, very early on. Let's pause to look very briefly at what he's saying here. He's saying that wisdom is power, and that her prime minister is justice. So justice is somehow intrinsically, he's implying that it's intrinsically related to wisdom. And he says that this relationship between wisdom and justice is the perfected law of truth. So again, without going into quite what he means about it yet, we're going to explore that in the presentation. He's implying that there's a connection between wisdom, justice, and truth. Let's go into that a little bit more deeply. Now, actually, I want to pause here and give you just one other little bit of background that I think is useful to understand the way that I'm going to present this. So I'm talking about justice in the context of a virtue. Again, we're introduced to that in the entered apprentice degree, where in the lecture we're reminded that there are 4 cardinal virtues: temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. These actually come from, he wasn't the founder or the creator of the idea, but he's the one who's most identified with this 4 cardinal virtues, is St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica. The four cardinal virtues, and cardinal comes from a Latin word meaning hinge. So they, literally what they're trying to convey is that these are not just elemental truths, but everything else kind of hinges on these four cardinal virtues. And part of what hinges on them are the three theological virtues that Aquinas contrasts with them. Those we are also familiar with: faith, hope, and charity. So again, justice as an idea, as a virtue, an idea of virtue, can go all the way back philosophically to Thomas Aquinas. But it goes further than that. Indeed, if you look at the etymology of the word, in virtue in Latin comes from virtus. It means manliness. So for the Latins, virtue is what defines being a man, being really a human being, but being what our species is. Our species is designed to be virtuous. For the Greeks, the predecessors of the Latins, the word that they used was arete. Arete meant for them, probably the best way to define it is moral excellence. And they didn't see it as necessarily strictly related to an individual's development, but they understood that a society evolved and developed and was predicated upon the moral development of its citizens. Again, anybody who studied the Greeks knows the pride that they had in Athens, and Athens coming forth as the first great, representative republic. We built America with part of the vision of Athens in mind. So this whole idea of virtue for the Greeks was to further the entire culture, to further the entire society. That's valuable, man. Virtue meant to them the relationship between men. It's what allowed a society, a country to be good. What an idea. Now, you can also, just one other I would mention is that in Sanskrit, the word is paramita, which means perfection. I greatly encourage anybody who's interested in the whole idea of virtues in general to go look at the Buddhist idea of paramitas. It is a remarkable moral structure that I really wish everybody was exposed to it a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go into it any further here, but I would just mention to you that they understood that virtue perfects, it polishes, it finalizes the man. So again, we see through all these cultures, different cultures at different times in history, that they looked and they said that virtue is really, really important. And Pike is saying to us that amongst all of the virtues, justice has a particularly highly elevated position, and we need to understand something about it. So given that background, let's first talk about, there's two ways to think about justice. One is as a cosmic justice, and the other is as a social justice. And what I'd like to do is address cosmic first. We'll make relatively short order of it, because it's really, in the long run, social justice that I think we as Masons are ultimately interested in, or as philosophers for that matter. So cosmic justice is this idea that really justice is predicated on some universal order or law. Again, in the East, the word is dharma. That there's some intrinsic truth that is built in, that God or the universe manifests, and we align with it. Now, the part of the problem here is that if it's only divine intercession, so if the only way that you can be good is because God frames it that way, you're encountering the dilemma of Job. So Job, as we all know, was this really good man, extremely faithful, the role model in the Old Testament. He followed every bit of the cosmic justice that the law articulated and sent down through the prophets and sent down through the writings in the Bible up to that period. But what happened? Jehovah was in a council of angels, if you will, and one particular angel, the adversary, challenges God and says, the only reason that Job is following you is because you make his life good. He does what he does what you ask him to, just because you support him. You pat him on the head, you give him good things, you make him a happy man. So really, he's just a wind-up doll. He's no different than Pavlov's dogs. And so the adversary said to God, he said, I challenge you, take it away from Job, and let's see if he remains faithful. Well, of course, as we know, Job did. God smote Job. God smote Job's family. God smote Job's land. He smote everything. It didn't matter what Job did. It mattered what God did to Job. This is cosmic justice. God decides on your behalf. It's not your behavior. God decides whether or not you met the standard. And then what happened, of course, is Job, having met that standard, God returned everything back to him. That wasn't the end of the story, though. Right at the very end of the book, Job kind of, is standing there feeling a little bit punch drunk, I imagine. And he says to God, well, really, gee, sir, I don't want to seem like I'm stepping out of my bounds here, but why did you do that? Why did you do that to me? And God thunders in the voice of the aeons and the voice of the ancients, and he says, where were you when I established the foundations of the universe? How can you question me? How can you doubt me? And that was the covenant that we were left with from the Old Testament. Now again, just to be perfectly fair, I'm emphasizing one piece of Old Testament notion of justice. It's obviously much more evolved than this. But from Job's point of view, and from God's interaction with Job, Job had no real control over what happened to him. Justice was an act of grace. He received the fair dues for his behavior because God decided to dispense it. And this is the notion behind, or one of the notions behind social justice or cosmic justice. If you're interested in this particular idea, I would recommend to you that there's two places you could go. There's actually more than that. But if you've never looked at it, the psychiatrist Carl Jung in 1952 wrote a book called An Answer to Job. And Jung comes to the conclusion that morally, Job was sort of right to challenge God and to say, why were you not just? Why were you not reflective of the very same things you demand of your creation? Why didn't you answer my question at the end? If you want a little bit of an edgier take on the whole thing, I would recommend to you a series of graphic novels by DC Vertigo called Preacher, which gets at very much the same thing. Not the TV show. The TV show, I'm not even sure if it's still on. Isn't worth the graphic novels, though, really entertain this question from a very interesting angle. Great series, Garth Ennis. Now, there's another way to think about cosmic justice, and that's the Eastern idea of karma, and karma is really cause and effect, if you will. It's just a really evolved notion of cause and effect. But in a lot of Eastern systems, in the long run, you don't have a whole heck of a lot of control in this life. If you violate the law, you violate the Dharma, you're going to be reborn. You're going to be reincarnated, and you're going to be reincarnated into a situation that's reflective, that is just in its alignment with what you did in this lifetime. It may take you several more lifetimes in order to undo what you did. But basically, justice is built into the equation. It's another kind of form of grace, if you will. You don't ultimately have a lot of control over it. You're under the whip. Follow the Dharma. If you don't, you're going to be reincarnated until you learn to follow the Dharma. There's no justice there. That's the justice of a horse having to pull the carriage and being whipped in order to follow it. You can learn, you can develop, but ultimately that's not really acting just. It's not a virtue. It has nothing to do with your ability to direct your own behavior. Any correction, any act of guidance or retribution comes from outside. It comes from the way it's built into the cosmos. We ultimately when we're, so you can look at reincarnation as kind of a comeuppance. It's more personally driven than grace, but it's really just, again, another kind of inevitable or irresistible alignment with destiny or the cosmic principle. One of the places where we first start to see an idea that maybe justice has to do with the immediate consequences of your actions is actually in Egypt. And we see this within the Scottish Rite, within the first section of the 31st degree, which is an Egyptian theme, where the soul of a man, a guy named Keris, is brought before the great tribunal of the gods. And his soul is his choices, his acts within life are weighed out against each other to determine whether he goes to kind of heaven or whether he goes to hell. And I won't give away which way the scales come down for Keris in the long run. You got to come and take the degrees if you want to know that. But here you can begin to see where there's a sense that your decisions ultimately have an immediate impact on how you're treated and what comes out of things for you. You can drive it, not a cosmic destiny or a principle or a background plan, but the plan is your choices. It's interesting that in many cultures, in many countries where there is a developed idea of cosmic justice, there is no real word for justice. There's a word for law, dharma, but there is no real idea or parallel concept to justice. So again, that kind of points us not towards cosmic justice, but towards this other idea of a social justice, a more personal justice. We begin to see this in the West, in modern philosophy, the place that I always like to kind of point back to, because, hey, what the heck, after all, he was a Freemason himself, is the Scottish philosopher John Locke. John Locke, in 1689, in the Second Treatise on Government, introduced a great metaphor, a metaphor that really is the foundation for all political science in the modern sense of the word. He didn't invent it, but he elaborated on the idea. And it's this idea of the problem of the commons. So I grew up in New England and then moved to Santa Fe when I was a teenager. And one of the things that's always interested me is that in both locations, towns have a central mall or plaza that's kind of a shared community space. In Santa Fe, the plaza used to be twice as big as it is now, actually even larger than that. And actually had a community use. It was used to graze cows. Not all the time, and it went through different historical uses. But in its earliest format, it was a guarded grazing property that was right near the Spanish fortifications. So good place to graze your cows. It was a desirable place to graze your cows. Now, imagine I come to the plaza, I'm a citizen, and I've got a cow. I own one cow. My entire livelihood depends upon this cow. And then Brother Alex, who's my next door neighbor, he's got 3 cows. And Alex wants to, just as much as I want to keep my 1 cow healthy and alive and fed, Alex wants to keep his 3 cows healthy, alive, and fed. But the plaza can only handle 2 cows. So what do? Alex might be inclined to say, well, Mark, you've only got 1, go, you could find some other place and just, kind of move them around. I need at least, I've got 3 cows. It's a much bigger deal to have to figure out. So I really think that really the answer here is that 2 of my cows need to be on the plaza, and then we each have to figure out where the other ones go. There might be an argument that I might make that, hey, my 1 cow, minority rights. My 1 cow should be allotted, and you should get 1 cow, and we're equal. Well, you can begin to see how there's many different approaches to defining what the problem of the commons is. We own this land, we own this piece in common, but there's no written rule. There's no pre-existing cosmic plan that says how we got to deal with this plan, with this plot of land that we hold in common. I own it, but you own it too. How do we relate to each other? This is a fantastic metaphor. Very worth your meditations, brethren. Very worth going back in, if you've never done it, and reading some of the pieces in John Locke's second treatise. This is an important document, still is. But you can begin to see where it begins to frame this notion of justice as a sense of equity or balance or harmony. What we're seeking here in order to address the problem that the commons introduces, and really the commons itself is a metaphor for the fact that human beings don't do well when they live together unless they have some rules to guide how they're going to live in common, how they're going to share with each other. We are intrinsically, you don't have to agree with me, but it's what I think. We are intrinsically kind of selfish. We take care of ourselves, and we watch out for number 1. We have to develop other ways of thinking about ourselves as a citizen, as a part of a family, as a part of a community, and then what that means to watch out for number 1 begins to change. But intrinsically, there's this idea that somehow or another, we have to seek or be constantly trying to define what we mean by the greater good that we all participate in. Again, the framers of the Constitution looked, and one of the things that they did that wasn't quite unique at that point, but it was certainly still a revolutionary idea, was the idea that even the people in the minority have to have their rights, their voice, their ability to influence the politics and the government has to be preserved. Not only preserved, but protected, because watching out for me means I got to watch out for them. If they lose their rights, then ultimately I could be next. So suddenly my orientation towards this idea of balance, of equity, and my struggle to define what that would mean leads me to this idea of a greater good. And as I struggle to define what that means, I begin to change the way that I define myself and the way that I understand myself in relationship to the commons, in relationship to my fellow citizens, in relationship to my brothers and sisters in the world. So this whole metaphor of the commons really introduces us into the, hey, knock it off, into this idea of social justice. And it's social justice is predicated on this idea of equity. Now, it's important, I think, also to understand that when we frame what we are doing as being just or not just in the context of a social situation, it's really important to understand something about justice. Justice in this context is oriented towards the future, not towards the past. In the context, which is again very different than if you think about what the purpose or the outcome of a cosmic justice is. Cosmic justice is kind of always looking back, always dinging you for what you did in the past. Social justice says we need to achieve equity. I can't change the past. What I want to do is shape the future. I want to shape and govern how the commons, how people are going to interact with each other, how we define the common good or the greater good going forward. So justice in a social justice context is not punitive. It's corrective. It's guiding. Which again isn't to say that it doesn't have an element of that correction doesn't contain an element of retribution, but retribution is implied as a corrective function. So in other words, I cross the street, I jaywalk, I get a ticket. The ticket isn't designed to somehow undo the fact that I jaywalk. It's designed to shape my behavior going forward, to discourage me from jaywalking because, heck, that could cause an accident. It's not part of the greater good. My little personal behavior needs to be corrected in order to protect the greater interests of society. So social justice, again, always looks forward, always looks to be corrective. And indeed, when Pike takes us from that introduction to justice in the Fellowcraft chapter of Morals and Dogma and gives us the seventh degree, provo and just, he does a really interesting thing, and it's a remarkable piece of political science writing. What Pike says in his usual long kind of roundabout way of getting at it, but he's very thorough, is that justice, again, is not fundamentally retributional. It's not revenge. It's about correction. And if we're going to emphasize justice this way, he goes on to add that we have to understand that justice, one of the cardinal virtues, is intrinsically connected to one of the theological virtues. And the one that it's intrinsically connected to is charity. And what he says is that in order to be corrective, justice has to be enacted through a spirit of charity. In other words, it has to be void of presumption, void of judgment in order to be justice. It's not to say that you don't take account for whether somebody followed the law or not, but what you do within yourself as the judge is to understand that, the old maxim from Matthew 7:1 is, judge not lest ye yourself be judged. When I pass a judgment, when I'm seeking justice going forward in a corrective perspective, I'm in no position to be able to see behind the soul and peer into the intent of what another human being did. I can judge his actions at their face value. The behavior you did was either good or bad. but I can't necessarily presume to be able to judge you and your worth in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the general good. I'll tell you, one of the things that I had to learn, just as a personal aside, and I still struggle with this on a near daily basis, is that it's very easy for me to think that if you disagree with me on any topic, especially if it's politics, baseball, a couple of other topics, but particularly those two, it's easy for me to think you're a bad man. I'm a New York Mets fan. If you're a Yankees fan, you are a bad man. Sorry, Lou. It's easy for me to want to make a judgment because you don't agree or conform to my thinking. But I don't really know what your history is. I don't know what makes you a Yankees fan. We're actually both baseball fans. Can't we celebrate that together? Isn't that what's really most important? So what you do or what you choose to believe is not something that I can really have a right to comment on. I can comment on your social behavior and its consequences and whether or not it needs to be corrected and whether or not it's directed towards our mutually defined notion of a common good, how we're going to deal with the commons. But it's God's job to look into your heart and to ultimately judge you. My job as a citizen is to determine whether your behavior aligned with the law and then to give you an opportunity to correct that behavior. That might include retribution, but the retribution is not revenge. It's not attempted to correct something in the past. It's attempting to correct something and shape your behavior going forward. So again, from that angle, that's one of the reasons symbolically that we see justice wearing a blindfold. Justice is always impartial, void of presumption. And what it does is it raises the scales and allows your behavior, the choices, what you did, to weigh the good versus the bad. Now, one other thing that Pike emphasizes in the seventh degree that I think is a very important aspect of how we apply justice. And I got to tell you, this is another small personal aside. So some of our brethren who are visiting from out of our jurisdiction, several years ago, there was a disagreement in the Valley of Santa Fe Scottish Rite with the direction that the leadership was taking the valley. There was within the core of the leadership a decision to sell our temple building, which met with a great deal of consternation from the membership at large. Without going into the details, Sovereign Grand Commander Seal at the time actually came out to New Mexico and ended up, again, a much longer story than I'm giving it stage for, ended up coming down supporting the brethren, the membership, and really basically reassigned. He took the the SGIG in New Mexico and replaced him. Now, very shortly after those events occurred, I was asked by the new deputy to come in and do a quick presentation on this seventh degree, on provo and judge, because of just this theme that it talks about. And I will never forget, and admittedly, this was several years ago, but I will never forget that when I was getting to the point that I'm about to get to, how many brethren that I hold in great esteem, sat there vehemently shaking their head. No, 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 that's not right, that's not true. And what I was saying to them was the other piece that Pike emphasizes in the seventh degree about justice and about how we use it correctively. And he said that the greatest tool, if you will, that you have to do this is forgiveness. Again, your job here is not to judge. Your job is to correct and help shape behavior, not to judge motivation, not to judge whether somebody's intrinsically good or evil. You're going to have a sense of that. You're going to want to reify it, but you're not God. and you cannot see into somebody's soul. I've done hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of therapy with people, and I have a hard time seeing into their mind, much less into their psyche or their soul. So what Pike said was, you know, the greatest thing that you can do is you don't forget. You don't you don't you don't substitute forgiveness for justice. But what you do, because ultimately justice is a tool of charity, it's void of presumption, it's void of judgment. It's given freely, and it's given out of a spirit of love and correction and guidance and brotherly fraternity. That it's an expression of agape, of charity. And so it's the highest form of what we can do. And then ultimately, really, forgiveness in the context of justice allows us to enact any consequences free of judgment, solely for the purpose and the intent of correction. But it also frees us, ourselves, the judges, from being equally trapped in the emotions and the feelings and the retribution and that need to somehow enact a retrospective judgment in the past, a justice that we can never get to. This is a picture here on the right. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, of Brant Jean, the brother of Botham Jean. And he's hugging Amber Geiger in September 2018 in Dallas as her trial was kind of coming to an end. She was the police officer who came home late one night, went into the wrong apartment, and shot Botham Jean to death. And this is his brother forgiving her. Again, not substituting, not forgiving or wiping off the sentence and the justice that needs to be enacted, but telling her that he himself did not judge her motives. And he was able to forgive her. And by doing that, buys himself a degree of closure or freedom that he would never ultimately have. So, brethren, when we look at justice, particularly when we emphasize it from this angle of the seventh degree, it really gives us a much, much richer idea than we have from just this idea of an antiquated cosmic justice, or even this idea that justice is somehow something about retribution, and that's how we get to equity. That's how we get to the balance that allows us to govern and to live together and to use the commons together. Really what justice is about how we shape and correct each other's behavior in accordance with a common understanding, or at least agreed upon understanding of what the law or the Dharma is. And as we make choices together, we don't judge each other's motives. We presume that we're trying to figure out all how to be good. And the greatest tools that we can bring to bear are justice in that social sense of equity, but also the final equity becomes the ability for us to forgive, to not judge, but to be free again in our relationship with each other, so that in a sense, we're born again to each other through justice. I don't have to be your judge. You have to be your judge. God has to be your judge. My job is to walk with you on the journey of learning how to be a more virtuous and a more perfected Mason, brother, citizen, husband, person. Brethren, thank you. That's what I got to say. I hope there was something in there that you can find meaningful. This is an important topic, I think, and obviously has kind of implications for a lot of what our country and our world is going through right now. I think these are important ideas, and I hope they are things that we can find a way to get into, to discuss a little bit more openly, and evolve ourselves, because we are woefully stuck right now. So, brethren, as always, thank you for the opportunity to give you my 2 cents worth on an important subject. I hope it was useful to you.